So my goal really is to actually try to make the topic of sex interesting, says the guy wearing a tie. So the goal today is to start with some basics about defining sex, defining the sexes, and defining and learning how to understand and to identify cases where reproduction is either sexual or asexual. Next class we get into really the evolutionary theory. Why does sexual reproduction, or for that matter, asexual reproduction, evolve? So today's basics. Next class we get into evolution a little bit more heavily. So hopefully everybody appreciates and knows actually what a computer mouse is, but clearly sexual reproduction is something that happens throughout the animal kingdom, plant kingdom, and maybe some other kingdoms as well. So I just mentioned that today's goal is to cover chapter 16.1, which is basics about sex and sexual reproduction. The next couple of classes will do 16.2 and 16.3. So the costs and benefits of sex. That's where we start to get an insight into why would sex evolve in the first place. Because there are times when sex is not good. There are times when sexual reproduction, that is beneficial. So to understand why we sexually reproduce, we have to be able to balance both of those. Why is it detrimental? When is it detrimental? And when is it beneficial? So while we let them move their desks around upstairs, does anybody have any questions? Yeah?
Why don't you put in the audio track, why don't you put salt and peppers, let's talk about sex. That should have been a good song. Yeah.
I considered starting with Let's Talk About Sex, but I wasn't sure if anybody knew that song anymore.
Come on.
I've got this great picture of birds and bees asking each other, hey, you know what we do? But yeah, there are tons of great things that you can add into discussing sexual reproduction in class. So the goal today is basically an introduction about variation in how organisms reproduce, both sexually and asexually. And then my goal for you by the end of the day, they're pretty straightforward. They should be relatively simple. If I give you a case study or an example, can you tell me, is that, by an evolutionary biologist's perspective, does that count as sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction? And then specifically, we'll talk about one form of asexual reproduction, parthenogenesis. Does anybody know what parthenogenesis is? Virgin birth, yeah, basically. So we'll get there. But parthenogenesis, reproduction without sex. Crazy. In sexually reproducing organisms. And Darwin even mentioned parthenogenesis in his book. This is one of the big questions over a decade ago, and it still is. So why does sexual reproduction occur? What's the benefit? And again, we talk about that more next class. But that was even Darwin's questions. We wanted to know, we know that some species undergo asexual parthenogenic reproduction. What's the point of having sex? So I'd like you to help, I'm surprised, nobody came up with this topic, which occasionally people talk about in their term papers, the evolution of orgasm, because most species don't do orgasm, but humans do. So if you think about it, right now I demand that you think about orgasm. If sexual reproduction is essential for the propagation of a species, shouldn't that be enough of a motivation to have sex? Why is it only in our species and very few other species that sort of beneficial feeling has evolved? Because in most species, you hear cats reproducing during the spring, right? There's a lot of the females don't necessarily enjoy it. There's a lot of meowing or yowling and not good sound. So it's interesting. I want you to help me brainstorm though. What do you know about reproduction in organisms generally? So there's organisms that have sex. Mammals. Can you think of a way that sexual reproduction occurs besides the way we do sexual reproduction? Internal fertilization, copulation. What other species do sex differently than we do? Any species.
Flatworms.
Okay, so I heard flatworms. So what do flatworms do? Okay. So flatworms, we've got hermaphrodites. So one organism makes both sperm and eggs. So you can self-fertilize. Then you've got, somebody said planaria. So what about planaria?
Chop it into pieces and it'll come back.
So we've got the ability to regenerate. So if you take a planaria and cut it in half, maybe you've taken biology 155, where we love to do this, developmental biology. We buy some planaria, you cut them down the middle this way, you cut them across down the middle this way, and you see, yeah, flatworms, some flatworms can regenerate. So you cut one individual and it forms two new individuals. Right? That's a mode of reproduction. Not the way we do it.
There's broadcast spawning.
Okay, so you've mentioned fish, but there's also, so there's broadcast spawning, where you just jettison your oocytes and sperm out into the water column and say, hey, free for all. Was that what the fish comment was about?
Yeah.
Okay. There is one hermaphroditic fish, which is interesting. It's one of the only self-fertile hermaphroditic vertebrates. So most vertebrates do sexual reproduction, but there are some that are hermaphrodites. What other sorts of species do you know about that? Well, every species has to reproduce. That's one of the definitions of being a living thing. So are these the only mechanisms of reproduction? Sporulation. So what sort of organisms are we talking about there?
You could either do parasites or fungi.
Okay, fungi, parasites. Anything else? Fission. What species are you thinking about when you talk about fission? Bacteria? Does conjugation count as reproduction? So what's conjugation? So the bacteria touch, they form, what's the structure they form? Is that a pilus? Pili? Plural? Okay, and then they exchange genetic information. It sounds like sex, but they're not really reproducing. They're just transferring genetic material, so we could put that down here too, though. So is conjugation a form of sexual reproduction? And you'll see in your textbook that this is where there is a huge gray area here. And not all scientists agree on what counts as sexual versus asexual reproduction. But this is a good diversity, right? A lot of organisms have a lot of different methods of reproducing. And we haven't talked about plants, generally speaking. But plants, there are some selfers, there's some outcrossers, a lot of sexual reproduction. Maybe there's some asexual reproduction too. So first I want to start with yeast, only because there are cool movies to show about yeast. So how do yeast reproduce? Okay, so yeast do fission, they bud. So here's a fabulous time lapse of yeast budding, in case you're not familiar. So for example, you can watch each of these cells sends a little bit of cytoplasm out into a daughter cell. The daughter cell gets bigger, and that's how yeast, that's one way yeast reproduce. Fission. So mother cell sort of starts pushing some cytoplasm into a new cell. Eventually those two bud off from each other, and you get two cells instead of one. Okay. How else do yeast reproduce?
They also do sexual reproduction.
So they also do, this is one of the crazy things about yeast, they do both. Yeast can either sexually or asexually reproduce, which is crazy. Not many species can do this. And this involves a process called shmooing. It's like a googly word. They shmoo. So this is a movie that shows budding and shmooing. And what shmooing is when you have yeast, we'll see this on the next slide, but yeast can have two mating types. Kind of like we have males and females, yeast can have A types and alpha types. And what you're going to see is essentially the same thing as the last movie. We have mother cells, we have daughter cells, and each of these are going to bud. And this is a slightly longer movie. It's almost a minute long. But what I want you to look at is the shape of these cells as this movie proceeds. So right now, most of these are round. Some of them are a little bit oval shaped, but mostly they're round. So you can watch a cell here, for example, start to bud off, a daughter cell. So over time, that daughter cell gets bigger and bigger, and eventually it becomes its own free-living cell. But watch the shapes of the cells. When do you start seeing cells that are no longer quite round? This one. What's it doing? What's that one doing? They're not budding.
Replicating enough to.
What that is this is a sign that a yeast cell is trying to have sex. It's trying to find an individual of the opposite mating type. So it's like females trying to find males, males trying to find females. So this slide shows the two different forms of reproduction in yeast. So on the left side, we have the typical haploid life cycle. So you can have haploid yeast. They're one of the two mating types here, either alpha yeast or A yeast. So those are the two sexes. So you've got not males and females, we've got A's and alphas. And each of those individuals that is a sex of yeast is haploid. They've got one copy of the genome. And they can bud and reproduce and produce daughter cells just like diploid yeast can, yeast that have two copies of their genome. So diploid yeast can cell cycle, they can bud off and produce daughter cells that are diploid. And haploid cells can go through cell cycle and produce daughter cells that are haploid. Then what happens is, speaking of conjugation, that's where sex is, right there. So if the right thing happens, especially in starvation conditions, where there's no more sugar left in their environment, then the yeast cells that are A's and alphas that are haploid try to come back together and fuse, essentially. So you've got an A cell, for example here, you've got one A cell that can come together with one alpha cell. And they conjugate. Those two A and alpha cells fuse together and produce another diploid organism. So that's kind of like where the sex is. This is almost like two gametes, haploid cells, fusing to form a diploid organism. And this process has been really well studied in yeast. And the way this happens is A cells have a particular receptor on their surface, right? A square-shaped, in this diagram, receptor. So A cells are looking for some chemical signal that alpha cells produce. So if you're an A cell, you've got a square-shaped receptor. The alpha cell produces molecules, hormones essentially, pheromones. And so that's how the A cell can try to detect where an alpha cell is in its environment. Because of course yeast don't have eyes. So how are they going to find another cell of the opposite mating type to mate with?
Ligand receptor response?
Right, so it's a receptor, there's a ligand, the pheromone, and the concentration, for example, of the red molecules, the squares, is highest near the cell that's emitting them. So in this A cell only has those ligands binding to one side of its cell surface, right, on the right side here. So that's the direction that that cell will extend its cytoplasm into what we saw in that previous slide. When they start pushing their cytoplasm in one direction, they're moving in that direction. This is the direction that they sense a higher concentration of their mating pheromone that they receive and are attracted to. And this, for whatever reason, that projection is called a shmoo tip. So be a biologist, because if you happen to discover some really cool thing that some species does, you can name it, whatever you want. Somebody should probably Google shmoo and see what happens. I'm sure there's a history page somewhere that describes, who named it and why it's called a shmoo tip. But that's the sign that yeast have starved and that these two cells that are shmooing are haploid. They're essentially gametes, and they're trying to find a yeast cell of the opposite mating type, the opposite sex, to fuse with, to once again produce a diploid offspring, or a diploid individual anyway. Not really offspring. Any questions about yeast mating? They do asexual reproduction in that they can cell cycle and just bud off asexually daughter cells. But those daughter cells, if they're haploid, can fuse together, which is essentially sexual reproduction. One of the few examples of species that do both, sexual and sexual reproduction. Those of you that have the lyrics from the rap song, by the way, they're all on both the audio track and the lyrics. The Word document are on Blackboard now for anybody. So if you want to download the lyrics or the track or both, they're in the course documents section. And one of the organisms that Baba mentioned, I think that one of your groups actually came up with, was talking about Dictyostelium discoideum, which is hard to rhyme with something else, but Baba managed to do it in the track. And they have a particularly interesting form of reproduction as well. So Dictyostelium, these are single-celled organisms crawling around on a plate. So Dictyostelium is a slime mold, normally unicellular. But what happens is when food is exhausted, right, there's always an environmental cue. All of these organisms that were free-living unicellular organisms come together into a big mass. And this is one of the reasons that Dictyostelium and slime molds in general are used by a lot of evolutionary biologists, because they're a good model system for understanding how multicellularity might have evolved. So they're normally free-living individual cells doing their own thing, but when they're faced with stress, they come together and they form these basically multicellular organisms. These are called slugs. So this is a mass of individuals that are cooperating together to form these big masses of multiple cells, and then they move around the plate. And what they're trying to do now is they're trying to find a new source of food. So the idea, theory, maybe, is that if you were evolution and you were trying to help Dictyostelium, slime molds, survive, the idea was that the slug can move faster than an individual amoeba, the individual cell. So it's maybe beneficial to these slime mold cells when there's no food left to aggregate and to move together to try to find a food source. Yeah?
And when they find it, do they deaggregate?
Right. So if they find more food, then they disaggregate and they can keep feeding as individuals. But they also do something really cool to reproduce. An error occurred. That's not good. Especially not good for reproduction. Should we try again? There we go. So here's one of those slugs again. Ooh, look, music. It's going to be all exciting. You too could be an undergraduate, oh, you are undergraduate students, and make movies of slime mold. So here are some of those amoeba, the single cell versions. So here they're starting to come together. Yes, you can bust apart one of those slugs, and then all the cells will come back together and form another slug, the multicellular form. How dramatic. Like there's one soundtrack for all nature movies, I think. Okay, so here's the interesting thing about sex in Dictyostelium. So if they can't find any food, then that multicellular, the slug, does this. It stands up on end, and it pushes some of its relatives, I guess, other single cells up on the tip of this stalk. And at the very tip of the stalk on the top are cells that are going to turn into spores that are long-lived, and presumably this stalk lifts them up high enough on the substrate, wherever they're living, that they might accidentally get picked up by an insect that's walking by or something. So these spores get stuck to an insect that will carry them somewhere else that might have more food. But what happens is that those cells that make up the stalk, the ones that lift all of their siblings and brothers and sisters and cousins up to become spores, all basically decide, they essentially die. They're still alive, but they're not ones that are going to be able to find food, reproduce, pass on their genes. So evolutionary biologists love slime molds for this reason. that you get this transition seemingly within this one species from a multicellular, single cell form to a multicelled form. And in that multicellular form, only some of the cells, specific cells, are destined to become gametes. And other cells that were formerly all those individual free-living amoebas are destined to become basically somatic cells, like our body cells. They're not going to be reproductive. They're just there to allow the greater good of the organism, basically, to help some of the cells reproduce. So many different mechanisms in the animal and plant and bacterial kingdoms of reproducing.
So they're sacrificing their fitness, but not their existence.
Exactly, yes, that's a good way to put it. They're sacrificing their fitness, but not their existence. So the cells are still there. The cells are still alive, part of the stalk that lifts the fruiting body way up in the air. They're still alive, but yes, their fitness is zero. They are guaranteed not to reproduce. So why would you do that? If evolution's all about fitness and reproducing and having offspring, in what scenario would you say, you know what, that's fine, I'll help you reproduce?
Family reproduction.
Okay, so there might be, so say that again?
If they're going and furthering the fitness of family members.
So this gets into a topic that we're not going to have time to talk about in depth in class, something like kin selection. So if you happen to have close relatives of yours, like your cousins, brothers, and sisters, and other cells of the same species, you're doing your part to help them reproduce. So in a sense, if you are genetically similar to them, you are still helping your genome pass on to future generations. If you're one of these dictyostelium cells that's part of the stalk. So it's individual sacrifice, but at least genomes, genes, alleles that are related, closely related to you get passed on. It's better than nobody reproducing. And the whole lineage of that population going extinct. The selfish gene. Yeah. Okay. So here's yet another example of cool sexual reproduction. Wait, not sexual reproduction, reproduction. This is parthenogenesis. So you have a snake that 2 years ago gave birth and was never exposed to a male, female snake, all of a sudden had babies. You're like, what the hell's going on? And then 2 years later, the same snake, or approximately 2 years later, the same snake gives birth to offspring again, having not been exposed to a member of the opposite sex. So what's going on? This is parthenogenesis. So we'll talk about parthenogenesis and the details of how parthenogenesis occurs in a little while. So this is the virgin birth idea, that a single individual that is either male or female can reproduce on its own without having sexual reproduction. Then we've got these cute little segmented worms, neodine annelids. If anybody was here last year during one of our colloquium seminars on Friday afternoon, one of my colleagues from University of San Francisco came and talked about reproduction in these segmented worms. And this cartoon maybe, I don't know if it helps or doesn't help you figure out what's going on, but what these worms do is they grow by adding segments. And if you look right here, what happens is an individual in the middle of its body, an individual worm starts growing segments that eventually become a new tail and a new head. So this worm is basically budding, like yeast or bacteria, during its lifetime. So this is how this species reproduces. It doesn't have gametes, well, at least not in this form. It just grows a new head and a new butt in the middle of its body, and then it breaks by itself when those parts are formed. So you get a longer worm, a longer worm, a longer worm as its new tail and head form in the middle of its body. And then when that development process is complete, it basically breaks in two. You've got two individuals where there used to be one. So this is a form of fission. This is called paratomic fission. that process of growing new body parts, a new head and a new tail in the middle of your body, and then breaking to reproduce. Bless you. So this is just my version of here's some cool things and some cool ways that organisms reproduce in nature. We've talked about a variety of these processes. Now, if we talk about multicellular organisms, now we stop talking about yeast and bacteria for a minute anyway, and slime molds. We've probably talked, please forgive me, I beg your forgiveness. I talked about this in genetics and evolution, so I'm pretty sure we've already talked about this term, but how do you define who's a male and who's a female?
Produce sperm and eggs.
Okay, so males produce sperm. That's the easy answer. You got away with the easy part. So males produce sperm, females produce eggs. So now, go ahead. So we can talk about sex chromosomes. So we define humans, we can define males and females based on sex chromosome constitution. Is that the best way to do it? It depends. So you could say individuals, at least in humans, if we were talking about humans, XX individuals produce eggs, XY individuals produce sperm. So we've sort of got a cell biology approach to defining who's which sex. We've got a genetic approach, and this is true for humans, not necessarily true for all species. So now the question is, how do you define what a sperm is and what an egg is?
Large, immobile, mostly egg, fast, varieties.
Okay, so we've got modal and small, which I know I'm writing over my words, which is horrible. I apologize again. And the immobile and large gamete is the egg. So really, from a biologist's point of view, the easiest way to define the sexes that works for most species on the planet, because we don't know a lot about, for example, the sex chromosomes in all the species. It's relatively simple to figure out who produces the large immobile gametes. Those are the ones we call eggs. Those are the individuals that we call female. And we've got individuals that produce small motile gametes. So those are what we call sperm, and those people that produce sperm are the people that we generally refer to as males. Although again, there's a gradient between male and female in most species. So it's basically impossible to binary categorize you're male, you're female. But as long as you understand that this is a generalization, that's fine. We've got definitions of how you determine who's a female and who's a male based entirely on what sort of gametes they produce. And so your textbook defines asexual and sexual reproduction as I put up here in the table. That if you're an asexually reproducing organism, there's just one parent. There's one existing organism that produces another. And its sexual reproduction, by definition, requires two individuals to participate in the process of producing one. And in this case, it mentions male and female gametes. In other words, fertilization, syngamete, the bringing together of two gametes. Why did I put that question mark in the middle?
Those people, or excuse me, those organisms that can go and use both mechanisms.
So for organisms, so what sort of organisms could be in the middle here? What doesn't fit either of those strict definitions? Organisms, so organisms do both. For example, yeast. So what about hermaphrodites, like C. elegans, I heard mentioned? So that involves a single parent, the hermaphrodite, but it also involves both sperm and egg. And so this is not just for C. elegans, but for all self-fertile hermaphrodite species, of which there are a huge number. Not so much in the animal kingdom. Well, not so much in vertebrates, at least. Invertebrates, yes. So this is, I'm trying to get across this point, that this is a gray area. It's hard to make strict definitions about what's asexual reproduction and what's sexual reproduction. What I really want you to be able to do is to apply the definitions that are provided in the textbook, these definitions essentially. Asexual, one parent, no gametes. Sexual reproduction, two parents, two types of gametes. And be able to argue what's in the gray area. So this is where there is not necessarily a right answer, as long as you understand the concepts and you apply them. So if I say on an exam, does C. elegans sexually reproduce or not, I'm just looking for your understanding of the concepts. So you can argue either way. Fine with that. So this is a summary of what I just mentioned. Right? This process right here in this picture is what sexual reproduction is all about. Syngamy, the bringing together of two gametes, the small motile one from a male and the large immobile one that females produce. So this is sort of an easy or basic way to break down sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction here. So if you've got the bringing together two different types of gametes, clearly that's sexual reproduction. So that's what you look for if you're going to define a species as sexually reproducing. That's the most important thing, is that sperm meets egg. Asexual, on the other hand, there's a number of different ways that this happens. We already talked about budding, fission. We've got the segmented worms that do paratomic fission. They grow new body parts and they split in half. We've got bacteria, yeast. That's the B, other tissues part. So I would count that paratomic fission as basically a form of cloning, or cutting a planaria in half and having two individuals produced from the body of one. It doesn't involve gametes, it involves actual somatic tissue that regenerates. The critical part here is to understand how parthenogenesis works, virgin birth. And we have some idea, just from basic biology and meiosis, our understanding of meiosis, so I hope everybody remembers this from genetics. So how could you have a single individual reproduce by itself and that individual is one sex, not a hermaphrodite? So we're not talking about an individual that produces both sperm and eggs. We're talking about, in this case, a female snake. This example is of a female snake. So that individual starts out life as a diploid. So all of its cells have two copies of every chromosome. Here we happen to be looking at their sex chromosome, although that's not necessarily relevant. So we could also talk about them having two copies of chromosome A, an autosome. So copy 1 came from their father at birth, copy 2 from their mother. So two alleles of one chromosome. And during cell division, when you have a cell that's going to turn into a gamete, snake that's going to produce, it's a female snake, so which gamete it's going to produce? Eggs. No, it's okay. It was the so easy question I didn't actually expect anybody to answer. I'm actually surprised some of you said anything. Right, so if you're a female snake, what's going to happen during meiosis is you're going to produce oocytes. Right. So a ZW cell will divide, and during meiosis, during division 1, right, first there will be synthesis. So right before meiosis 1, there would be 4 copies of that. There would be 2 Z's and 2 W's inside that cell. It's the first step of meiosis, synthesis. And then that after the first division, the two Z's would go into one daughter cell, the two W chromosomes would go into the second daughter cell after the first division. So we temporarily have diploid cells. And then here is where the second division happens. Division 2, right? One Z goes into one cell, the other Z into the other cell, and we get two W cells down here. So now we've got haploid cells. You might remember that in meiosis, only one of the four products in a female of meiosis is an actual functional oocyte. That the other three products are polar bodies. They're not able to be fertilized. Okay, so we've got one mature egg cell, we've got three polar bodies. Each of these cells is haploid. So we start with 4 sex chromosomes in the first cell, 2 Z's and 2 W's, and we wind up, after meiosis, with 2 Z's and 2 W's in the 4 cells that are produced from meiosis. So we've got a good accounting of all the chromosomes that are supposed to be there. Parthenogenesis, what happens? It's a diploid individual that makes haploid gametes. How do you make a diploid individual from just one parent?
It replicates itself.
So what does it say happens up here? Right here.
Combines with the second polar body.
Right. So what happens is this second polar body kind of acts like a sperm. It's not a sperm. This is a female individual. But if those two cells fuse, then you get a diploid individual again. You've got one cell that's got 2 copies of the chromosomes. That's the idea of, at least that's our understanding of how parthenogenesis works. That in the process of making one oocyte, if it happens to be next to one of the polar bodies and those 2 cell membranes fuse, like at fertilization between a sperm and an egg, in this case, if it's an egg and a polar body, that produces a diploid individual. This individual. And as it says up here in the upper right, in snakes, if you're ZZ, if you have 2 Z chromosomes, 2 sex chromosomes that are Z, you become a male. So in this case, that would be a female individual parthenogenically giving birth to a male offspring.
So now the male cannot do the same thing, so now it has to make, right?
Right, so a ZZ male can't do parthenogenesis because it doesn't produce oocytes. Right, if it produced, well, let's see, if it produced 2 sperm, ooh, this could get messy. So what happens in a male?
You get 4 haploids.
Well, presumably the same thing could happen during development in a male. The male could go through spermatogenesis and produce 4 sperm. 2 of them could fuse together to make a diploid organism. Then what happens?
Becomes female.
So in your spermatheca, in your vas deferens or in your testes, you've got this little tiny 2 cell, like what's going to happen? Nothing. Right? There's no egg, there's no nutrition for this single-celled embryo to develop. There's nowhere for it to develop. I mean, don't imagine, a human male doing this, right? So you've got a little tiny 1-cell diploid organism growing in your testis, right? There's no uterus, there's no placenta, there's no nutrition, so nothing happens if you're a male and parthenogenesis tries to happen. It's only females that are built to sustain an embryo to gestation and to deliver it to the outside environment. So the same process could happen in males, but it's not going to lead to actual viable offspring. Yeah?
You said there wasn't any milk in the Did you make it stop?
I wish I could make it stop. I had a really I'm kind of a crusty old man, or I had a long cruise day. Knock it off, you punk kids. So say that again?
So there's no males involved in this, is that right?
Yeah, so that's correct. So presumably, in this case, no males were ever involved in, for example, contributing sperm. Right, so this is an individual virgin female. That's why this is referred to as virgin birth. Most of the times that this has been identified is in cases where there was an individual that did not ever have contact with a member of the opposite sex and yet still wound up giving birth. Please do.
So
Ask as many as you like. We got
so she just fuses with one of the polar bodies, that's what happens a diploid individual?
Right, so A and O site fuses with a polar body, usually the second polar body, and that restores diploid.
Okay, I understand that.
Yep.
So the opposite can happen, right? She can produce a female.
That's also true. So you could have you could produce a female.
Right.
So either sex is possible from, well,
Depends on the chromosome.
depends, yeah, so it depends on the sex chromosome system. So you can only do that if you are, that's an excellent point. So in this game, all you have to do is tell me, so here's yeast. Is that sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction? Okay, so if it's asexual, why would you say that? It might be. Is it sexual or asexual, do you think? Okay, both. Maybe. So justify both.
Well, if they're starved and there's not enough nutrients, they're going to go asexual reproduction and it's conjugation. But if there's enough nutrients, then they're just going to butt and do asexual reproduction.
Okay, so we've got sexual reproduction here. Those are cells from two different, they're not sperm and egg. So this is the gray area. So either answer is fine as long as you justify it. So these are not gametes. These are single-celled individuals. So it depends on whether or not you want to call a single-celled individual a gamete. Right. But they do,
Gametes are single cells, so.
right, yep. And they also do budding. That would definitely fall, budding would definitely fall into the asexual reproduction category. One individual dividing into two individuals. What about the snake in virgin birth, parthenogenesis?
I would say sexual.
So here, asexual? Sexual?
Yes.
Asexual. So, what's happening when this individual produces another offspring?
It's more like a fission between two gametes, fusion between two gametes.
So it's like fusion of two gametes, except one of them is not a gamete. One of them there's one oocyte, but the other one's not a sperm. Right? Gray area? We all on board with it? So why would it be asexual reproduction?
Sexual reproduction is defined as two, both the male and female.
Right. So this does not have to do with two parents. This is one individual snake that's producing an offspring by itself. So this gets at a final important characteristic of sexual reproduction. So to lead us into next class, why do we do sex? What's the benefit? What's one of the main benefits of sexual reproduction? Right, recombination, genetic variation, bringing together genetic material from two different individuals. So in the case of the snake, what's its offspring going to look like genetically?
It should be almost a clone.
It should be a clone. Right? The offspring of this parent, or the offspring of this one snake will look genetically identical almost, or entirely, to its mom. So in that sense, this doesn't count as sexual reproduction if you talk about sexual reproduction being the combination of new types of genes from two different parents. That's why that two-parent concept is important. If you're a ZW-ZZ sex chromosome system. Right. So if you're genetically sex-determining species, you've got the case in humans and mammals in general, where if you've got a Y chromosome, you're male, and if you have two copies of the same sex chromosome, you're a female. The opposite is true in birds, snakes, and some other taxa, moths, for example, butterflies, where it's the heterogametic sex, ZW, that's female, and if you have two versions of the same sex chromosome, you're a male. So it's only in this case where parthenogenesis could lead to production of both females and males, because it's the female has to be the one that's involved in parthenogenesis. Right? It's oocytes that are going to produce virgin birth. So it's always the female. that does parthenogenesis. And in this case, on the left here, you've got an individual who has both of the sex chromosomes. So it's possible for that individual to produce both ZW and ZZ offspring. Whereas if you're an XX female, what sort of sex chromosome constitutions can you have in your offspring? Only X's. It's an interesting difference in how parthenogenesis works between different species. There's this really famous example of parthenogenesis in a shark. It's kind of like that news story I showed about the snake that had never been around a male. There was a shark that was in an aquarium. And this shark had been captured in nature, but as a baby shark. So it certainly had not reached reproductive age when it was captured in nature, and taken to this aquarium, and had been kept by herself in an aquarium for years and years and years and years and years, and then one day the zookeepers came in and there was a baby shark. So it never, certainly, had never been exposed while she was an adult, anyway, to a male shark of the same species, yet gave birth. And so that was one of many, 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 you can Google or use your favorite search engine to find, Google this process, and you'll find a few of these stories pop up. Like, parthenogenesis happens in here and over here, and so it's actually pretty widespread.
So when you have hermaphrodites, they have similar genetic material too, because they're coming from the same organism. So
Indeed.
Is that asexual?
So for C. elegans, you've got a hermaphrodite producing both sperm and eggs, but they're genetically identical gametes. So is that sexual or asexual? One parent, it's gamete fusion. Gray area. You decide. Briefly, while you work on this, one question on this Socrative activity just for today. Tell me what you found most interesting, one thing you found most interesting about today. And for those of you that are participating in this music video business, please have your groups. So I've got 3 groups so far. I don't want to call them leaders of the group, but 3 people that are in those groups are Hannah, Amanda, and Raphael. So those are the 3 groups I know about. If you're in a group and you do not have one of those 3 people in your group, you should let me know that you're a group. The lyrics and the audio track, again, as I said, are on Blackboard, so feel free to download them if you want them. And from the groups, I do need any suggested changes to the lyrics by 5 p.m. today that I can send to Bubba in case he needs to re-record something. Okay. And with that, thanks very much for your participation and your interest in sex, and we'll be back next week. Sorry, one question.